And with that, a few words about him. Rabbi Joshua Garroway, Ph.D., serves as the Saul and Arlene Bronstein Professor of Judeo-Christian Studies and Professor of Early Christianity and Second Commonwealth at HUC-JIR's Skirball campus in Los Angeles. Rabbi Garroway earned his doctorate from the Religious Studies Department at Yale University and was ordained at the Cincinnati campus of HUC-JIR in 2003. His first book, Paul's Gentile-Jews, Neither Jew nor Gentile, but both, in 2012, explores the ways in which Paul's epistle to the Romans constructs Jewish identity and the role played by this construction in the ensuing emergence of Christianity. His second book, The Beginning of the Gospel, Paul, Philippi, and the Origins of Christianity, published in 2018, offers a revisionist understanding of the origins of the Greek term, you're going to have to correct me on this one, Professor Garroway, euaggelion, I may have said that wrong, usually translated gospel, in earliest Christianity. He is currently working on a book-length project about antinomianism in Jewish history. And with that, I will turn it over to Rabbi Garroway.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me share my screen, which hopefully worked. All right, I hope everybody can see the shared screen. Amy, can you nod if you can? Okay, good. You asked for a little help pronouncing that word that was the subject of my second book. I'll help you out because we actually can learn some Greek that way. So the word is euaggelion. And we all know from Greek, EU means good. Like we have eulogy and other such words that start with EU. And angelos, which gives us angelion, we all know because we live in and around Los Angeles, right? So angelion means things that angels deliver or message. So euaggelion means good message. And of course, eventually in Christianity, that euaggelion, good message, came through Europe, where in Germanic languages, it became gut Spiel, which gives us the word gospel. So the word we know of as gospel is the Greek word euaggelion, and gospel means gut Spiel or good news, as does euaggelion. Just a little bit of Greek to get started. Before I do start talking about our subject of the day, which is the development of Jewish views on on Jesus and Christianity, I just want to say thank you to all of the people who make this Community Scholars Program a thing. I spoke with you, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago and loved it and was amazed at what I saw then. And now I find out you're in your 20th year and having daily lectures from the likes of Danny Matt and Paul Lips and other people I know and admire. And I kind of wish I can get involved and start joining you for some of your lectures because they sound terrific. And I'm really honored to have been selected to be one of the folks that you all can learn from. I also wanted to say, I did not pick this picture. I think Ari did, or someone, this picture of Jesus, but I always get excited when someone picks a picture of Jesus that I recognize. Because as you know, there are millions of pictures of Jesus on the internet, but this one I'm quite certain is from the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, if you've ever visited it. And it's quite beautiful. And I thought another thing that would be fun to point out at the beginning, a little Greek knowledge, is if you've ever wondered what those little letters are around the people, well, that's one of the ways that you can easily identify who they are. Because a lot of people in medieval Europe or Constantinople, were represented as white guys with beards. So how do you tell the difference between Jesus and Paul and Peter? Well, you may be able to see that to the left of Jesus's head, there's an iota and a final sigma. Yes, Greek has a final sigma, just as Hebrew has some final letters. And on the right side of Jesus's head, which I can't see because Amy Robinson Katz's picture is there, but I'm pretty sure it says chi, CH, and then another sigma. And those lines over the letters mean it's an abbreviation. So what this says is Jesus Christos, or Jesus Christ. And what's interesting is that we do this in Jewish language too. We abbreviate the names of sacred people and beings, especially God, as Hashem or something like that. Well, Christians do the same thing. So this is called nomina sacra, sacred names that are abbreviated. This says Jesus Christ, and it helps us to identify who that is. So what we're going to be talking about today is the way in which Jews have thought about Jesus and Christianity. And as you can imagine, that is a huge topic. It's a topic I could probably teach an entire course on, but we have 50 minutes or so before we do some questions. So what I needed to do in order to make it manageable and interesting is divide it up into some kind of easy chunks. So what we're going to do, and I have this written here, is the plan for the hour, is to break it up into 3 chunks. The first thing I want to talk about is the rabbinic period, and specifically the Talmud. What does the Talmud say about Jesus and Christianity? As you're going to see, we're kind of lucky in that the Talmud says almost nothing about Jesus and Christianity, which makes it easy to cover in 10 minutes or so. But then we're going to move on to the medieval period, when Jewish thoughts about Jesus and Christianity change considerably and develop considerably. And there are a number of passages that we're going to look at. And then, as you can imagine, we're going to conclude in the modern period. And again, the modern period has so many different ways in which Jews have thought about Jesus and Christianity. So I'm going to have to be sort of selective and pick a couple of trends that I think are important. But the plan for the hour, so you can figure out where we are, is to skip from the Talmud to the medieval period to the modern period. And I hope I'll show you some interesting transitions along the way. So with that, why don't we get started talking about the Talmud? What does the Talmud, the collection of rabbinic Jewish literature, from roughly the year 100 CE to 600 CE, a good 5 centuries worth of Jewish thinking, what does the Talmud have to say about Jesus and Christianity? And as I already suggested, the answer to that question is just about nothing. Indeed, there are some scholars who would say that the Talmud has absolutely nothing whatsoever to say about Jesus or Christianity. I don't think that's true, but even if we take a lot of the references to Yeshu as Jesus in the Talmud, we're still talking about, maybe a half dozen or so sections of the Talmud that have anything at all to do with Jesus or Christianity. Now, there are many explanations for why that is. The best of them might simply be that when we talk about the Talmud in Judaism, we're by and large talking about the Babylonian Talmud. That is to say, the Talmud that emerged in the eastern part of the rabbinic world, in what is today Iraq, where Christianity was not a significant presence, and indeed never would be. It would be a Sasanian presence, which would give way to a Muslim presence. And so it's possible that in that eastern realm, Christianity just wasn't on the radar of the early rabbis. The problem is when we look at the Palestinian Talmud, or the Talmud Yerushalmi, which was produced by the Western sages, you still don't see anything significant about Jesus. So it really is a riddle why the rabbis did not think a whole lot about Jesus or Christianity. And it's especially a riddle when you look at Christian literature from that period. Because from the moment Christianity emerged, starting with Paul all the way through figures you've probably heard of, like Augustine or Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Ambrose, all the old sort of Saint Catholic names, they are obsessed with Jews and Judaism. I mean, there are tomes written over and again by Christian scholars in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th century about Judaism. And yet when we go to the Jewish side, virtual silence on Christianity. And one of the likely explanations for that is that Christians were bent on trying to explain what Christianity meant in terms of what came before it, right? In order to defend Christianity's existence, one had to explain what it means in relationship to Judaism. Whereas Jews probably did not feel that pressure. Jews said, yeah, we're not Christian. We don't accept that Christianity is anything significant, so why would we talk about it at all? In some ways, and I don't know if this is true, but you might draw a parallel to contemporary Reform and conservative Judaism. that talk a lot about Orthodox Judaism, whereas Orthodox Judaism does not talk as much about Reform Judaism. For the simple reason that Reform and Conservative Judaism are often defining what they are as new and progressive, or whatever words they apply to it, in terms of what came before it, which is understood as Orthodox Judaism. Whereas the Orthodox feel less compulsion to define themselves over and against what is new and they reject. So I don't know if that's a perfect parallel, but the upshot of it is that when you look at literature from the first 5 centuries, Christians are talking about Jews constantly. Jews are almost never talking about Christians. When we do go to the Talmud, however, and look at the few cases in which the Talmud talks about Christianity, it almost exclusively talks about Jesus. There is no systematic addressing of Christianity or its basic theological ideas, discussions of the Trinity or the Incarnation. These sorts of things are of no concern to the Talmud. Where the Talmud talks about Christianity, it talks about Jesus. It is what we would call in Latin an ad hominem attack, right? Jesus. Jesus is bad, Jesus is a problem, and therefore, by extension, anybody that follows Jesus is a problem. But the focus is always on the figure of Jesus. And so there are 4 or 5 passages, as I've suggested, and I decided to pick one that is my favorite, and I think the most sympathetic Talmudic treatment of Jesus. By and large, the Talmud says Jesus was a rogue teacher of Torah. He started off good, he was teaching Torah, something went bad, and he became an idolater and a sorcerer and a magician and all kinds of other terrible things. That's the general flavor of all of the passages about Jesus. Some of them are really awful and vicious. If you want to choose one, I recommend you look at what I told you to compare here, Gittin 56b. This is a bizarre sugya in which the rabbis imagine a potential convert whose name is Onkelos, and he has the power to raise people from the dead. So he raises from the dead a lot of famous Jewish enemies and asks them what it's like in the afterlife. So first Onkelos raises the Emperor Titus, the one who sacked Jerusalem in 70. And he says, oh, Titus, what's it like in the afterlife? And Titus says, oh, I'm suffering. I burned every day and my ashes are scattered. And Onkelos says, oh, well, who's thriving in the afterlife? And Titus says, the Jews. And then he summons up Bilam, the subject of this week's Torah portion. And Bilam says, oh, I'm suffering in the afterlife. Every day I'm being boiled alive in hot semen. Yes, hot semen. And he says, well, Bilam, who is thriving in the afterlife? And Bilam says, the Jews. And then lastly, the Talmud says that Onkelos conjures up Jesus. And Jesus says, what are you doing? He says, Jesus, what are you doing in the afterlife? And Jesus says, I am being boiled alive along with my followers in hot excrement, not hot semen, hot excrement, which I imagine is considered worse in the sugya. And of course, he asks Jesus, who is thriving in the afterlife? And the answer is the Jews. So that is a bizarre text, and a text with a tremendous amount of antipathy towards Jesus. I alert you to its existence, but it's not the one that I would like to focus on in our time together. What I want to do is show you this passage from Sanhedrin 107b, which I think is a much more sympathetic picture of Jesus, even as it acknowledges that Jesus is understood as an idolater and a sorcerer. So that passage says the following, and in order to see it all, I'm going to need to move these faces, these faces on my screen a little bit. Actually, maybe I can put them up here. I apologize for this. Well, I'll just guess at the words on the right side. So it says, when King Yanai, and this is a reference to the Maccabean king Alexander Jannaeus, King Yanai, who did apparently not like the Pharisees very much. So it says, when King Yanai was killing the sages, Joshua ben Parachia, and Jesus went down to Alexandria. When there was peace, Shimon ben Shetach, who was back in the land of Israel, he sent for him And so Joshua got up and left, taking Jesus with him. Joshua and Jesus came to a certain inn where they honored Joshua greatly. Joshua said, "What a beautiful inn!" And Jesus said, Rabbi, her eyes are a little bleary. Now you might say, what's going on there? And here's a case where you need to know Aramaic. Because it just so happens that in Aramaic, the term for inn, achsania, is the same as the term for innkeeper. So what happens here is Rabbi Joshua looks around and says, what a beautiful hotel. But Jesus thought that he said, what a beautiful hotel worker. And Jesus says, no, I don't think she's that pretty. Joshua said, oh, you wicked Jesus, that's what you're thinking about? He brought out 400 shofars and excommunicated him. Jesus came before him several times and said, oh, Joshua, accept me back. I apologize. He didn't pay attention to him. One day, Joshua was in the middle of saying the Shema, and Jesus came before him. Joshua was ready to receive him back, but he gave him the wait a second gesture. I guess in Israel, it would be the shniah gesture with his hands, right? So you can imagine Joshua is saying Shema, and Jesus comes in and he gives him this. By the way, the wait a second gesture, that's a playful creation of mine in translation. That's not what the Aramaic says. Jesus thought that he was rejecting him, however. So what did Jesus do? He went and erected a tile and bowed to it. Jesus performed magic and misled and corrupted Israel. So in this passage, we get to the end, right? We get to the point, which is that Jesus is an idolater and a magician and a sorcerer and a bad guy. But the way in which it's reported here, I think, is actually a bit bittersweet. I mean, there's a certain poignancy to what's going on here, that it's all being chalked up to a giant misunderstanding. Actually, two misunderstandings. The first is that Joshua thought that Jesus was checking out girls at the hotel rather than checking out the beautiful lobby. That's misunderstanding one. And then the second misunderstanding is that Jesus was ready to repent from that. And Joshua was ready to accept it. But because of this 2-second problem, where Jesus happened to come in right when Joshua was in the middle of the Shema, which takes 5 seconds, Jesus misunderstood the gesture with Joshua's hands. And the result was Jesus leaving the ranks of the rabbis, becoming an idolater and a sorcerer, and so on and so forth. I think it's a really powerful passage that suggests that the Talmudic rabbis understand that Christianity is bad and Jesus is responsible for it. But there's also a certain sadness that they're suggesting Jesus was and could have been among the ranks of the great rabbis. There could have been no such thing as Christianity, but for a series of terrible misunderstandings. So this is the passage that I like the most from the Talmud, because it has this level of, I think, sympathy for the break between Jews and Christians, even as it arrives at the same place that all the other passages arrive at, which is to say, an ad hominem attack against Jesus as an idolater and a sorcerer who leads people astray. So that is the general picture of the Talmud. And what I would suggest to you is that this small number of ad hominem attacks against Jesus in the Talmud gets ramped up a notch in the subsequent centuries. So that in medieval literature, what you see is not just 4 or 5, but dozens of various legends about how terrible Jesus was as a person. And eventually, in a way we're really not sure of how it happened, eventually a lot of these legends get brought together into a coherent narrative about Jesus. And this is called the Toldot Yeshu, maybe the history of Jesus, which was probably written sometime around the year 900 or 1000. And when I say written, I don't mean that someone sat down and wrote this story of Jesus. What it is just collections of stories that were put together at one point. but it wasn't written down and published. So 100 years later, another version of it was written down. And then 100 years later, another version of it was written down, which means that when we speak about Toldot Yeshu, this medieval text that is a collection of stories about Jesus, there's not one Toldot Yeshu. There's countless manuscripts and different versions because different authors at different times have brought together different traditions. So for example, one version of Toldot Yeshu is what you see on the left here, Yeshu HaNotzri, the son of Yosef of Pandera. And this was written in Yiddish at the beginning of the 20th century. This is something that I imagine my grandparents or great-grandparents, some of you, maybe even your parents, would have purchased on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1910 to read about Jesus of Nazareth. And there have been variations of this Toldot Yeshu, again, 20th century Yiddish American culture, because it was published here in New York, all the way back to, say, the 10th or 9th century when this material began. This, I believe, is a manuscript from the Cairo Geniza of one version of Toldot Yeshu, and there are several in the Cairo Geniza. And then if you're interested in an academic approach to this medieval text, three folks, Peter Schaefer I know, the other two I don't, published a book a few years ago exploring this text and scholarship surrounding it. So what goes on in Toldot Yeshu? Well, as I suggested earlier, it's basically just the ad hominem attacks of the Talmud on steroids. So it pieces together from the beginning of Jesus's life to the end, every terrible thing you can imagine about Jesus. So it starts with his birth, and we learn that he was raped, or he was the result of a rape. Mary was raped by a Roman soldier. And we're told that she was menstruating while it happened. So it's not only bad enough that he's a bastard child, he's a bastard child born of menses, is actually what it says. Then we find out that one day he was with the sages and he pranced around without a kippah. And so they yelled at him and sent him up to the Galilee, but then he snuck into the temple and he learned the secret name of God. And he used the secret name of God to raise people from the dead and heal people and so on and so forth. So eventually the rabbis hired someone else to catch him, a guy named Judas Iscariot. And they let Judas Iscariot learn the secret name of God. And the two of them had a big contest. And eventually they both ended up losing their power. So then Jesus tried to sneak back into the temple to relearn the secret name of God. And that's when the rabbis caught him, and eventually he was put to death. And then, of course, there's a whole after story about how his followers lied and said that he has risen from the dead, and the story goes on. But again, it's not an assault on Christianity in terms of the ideas of Christianity. It's an assault on the man Jesus, a prolonged ad hominem assault on the character of Jesus. That's one development we see in the medieval period. What we also see in the medieval period, however, is the beginnings of a systematic approach to Christianity, an effort to say, what are the ideas of Christianity and why are they so bad? Now, there's probably a couple of reasons why this develops. One is that Jews start thinking systematically in the Middle Ages. There's nothing systematic about the Talmud. If you've read the Talmud for more than an hour, you know that it just bounces from here to there, this subject to that subject. It never sets down a series of principles and then makes arguments to come to newer conclusions, the kinds of things you expect in philosophical literature. But it's precisely in the medieval period where Jews start thinking often in more philosophical and systematic ways. So it shouldn't surprise us that eventually Jews start to think not just about Jesus, but about Christianity and as a system and how to attack that system. A second reason this literature probably develops is that if you think about where most Jews were living after the year, say, 800 or 900, most Jews were living in Islamic lands. Muslims were discovering philosophy, and Muslims were creating all kinds of polemical literature that systematically attacked Christianity. So Jews living in those Muslim environments in Spain, by and large, were absorbing those Muslim polemics and then eventually producing their own systematic approaches to Christianity, undermining Christianity at the level of the idea rather than the level of the man. So again, there are a number of examples I could point to you, but I'm going to show you my favorite because it's, well, you'll see. It's fun to read. Uncomfortable when you're reading it with undergraduates, but it's fun to read. So this comes from a work called The Book of the Covenant, which was produced by a scholar of I don't know, southern France, northern Spain. Let's call him a Pyrenees scholar. I don't know. And his name was Joseph Kimchi. He is not the first Korean rabbi. I make that joke all the time. Some people laugh. It's not Joseph Kimchi, but Joseph Kimchi. He is perhaps more famous for being the grandfather, I believe, of Rabbi David Kimchi, who was one of the great commentators of the medieval period, also known as the Radak. So if you know the Radak or David Kimchi, this is his grandfather, and I think it might be his father. And he was most famous for writing polemical literature against Christianity. And in one of those works, The Book of the Covenant, he presents it as a conversation between a Christian and a Jew. The Christian says things, and then he, the Jew, responds. And in this particular selection, the Christian has asked some sort of question about why Jews don't accept Jesus as God. And what he's going to end up doing is, in my mind, blowing away the Christian notion of the incarnation. There were two Christian ideas that really irked Muslims and Jews. One was the Trinity, for obvious reasons. Jews and Muslims both said God is one. We say that in the Shema every day. And here Christians were saying that somehow God is one, but also three. And Muslims and Jews ripped them apart. But the incarnation was even more problematic because the incarnation suggested something even more grotesque than idolatry. Not that a God took the form of a clay face that you might see at a temple. That's bad enough. But that God took the form of a living, breathing human, that was too much for a medieval Jew to accept. And so what Joseph Kimchi writes is it's a blistering assault on the idea of the incarnation. He writes, "Oh, Christian, how you rely on naught and depend on vanity. I believe in the creator of the world, according to Isaiah, who does not tire or weary, and whose understanding cannot be fathomed. Now that Jesus has come and appeared to the world, you believe that he is God and King of the world. And I am astonished and cannot believe this thing." And here's where it gets good. "The great and mighty God whom no eye has seen, who has neither form nor image, who said, 'For man may not see me and live,' how shall I believe that this great, inaccessible, Deus absconditus," right, a great, invisible God, needlessly entered the womb of a woman, the filthy, foul bowels of a female, compelling the living God to be born of a woman, a child without knowledge or understanding, senseless, unable to distinguish between his right and his left, defecating and urinating, sucking his mother's breasts from hunger and thirst, crying when he is thirsty, so that his mother will have compassion on him. And then Kimchi goes on to make an even more amusing point, which is that, "Oh, Christian, you deny that Jesus needed his mother's breast milk? Well, then you're suggesting that he sucked on his mother's breasts for pleasure." And he goes on and then accuses Christians of being perverts and so on and so forth. It's quite a lovely ribald passage. But what's going on here is a really powerful critique of the notion of incarnation. The idea being that if you accept that Jesus of Nazareth was God, you have to accept that at one point God was a little helpless baby that pooped in his diaper and suckled and didn't know anything and so on and so forth. And I often think, I don't know if this is a popular movie down in the OC, but the Talladega Nights, the Will Ferrell movie in which he's a race car driver. And there's a very funny scene in which he says a prayer before dinner, and he insists on praying to little baby Jesus, not big Jesus, but little baby Jesus. Oh, little baby Jesus, thank you for this food. And anytime he talks about that, I think about this passage. You know, that little baby Jesus actually has some profound theological implications for Christianity. And of course, there are many Christian legends about how Jesus was never really an incompetent little baby. You know, he was speaking when he was born, and he had full senses when he was born, and so on and so forth. But if you take the incarnation idea seriously, that Jesus experienced everything it is to be human, Kimchi has a point, that makes it very hard to reconcile with the things said about the greatness and the invisibility of God, who neither tires nor wearies, those sorts of things that are said in the Tanakh. So this is just one example of the way in the medieval period you see Jews moving from beyond just ad hominem attacks on Jesus to systematic attacks on the theology of Christianity. The Trinity is a bad idea, they say, and the incarnation is an idolatrous idea. And that is even worse than following a person who was a bad guy. But there was a problem in the Middle Ages. And the problem is that once you started to identify Christianity and the idea of the incarnation as idolatry, all of a sudden for Jews living in Christian lands, and starting in the 10th and 11th century with the rise of Ashkenaz in Europe, more and more Jews were living in Christian lands. If Jews are living in the lands of idolaters, there are all kinds of problems, legal problems, that Jews have to consider. Why? Well, you may know from the Mishnah and the Talmud that there are all kinds of very strict laws about how Jews can interact with idolaters. What I mean to say really is how Jews must avoid at all costs interacting with idolaters. So if you look at the Mishnah and the Talmud, you will see that it is clear that when it comes to idolaters, you can't marry them or have sexual relationships with them. You can't eat with them. You can't drink their wine or cook foods prepared by them. You cannot fraternize or have social intercourse. And you might say, well, this isn't such a big deal because if you're a Jew living in Ashkenaz, chances are you're living in a ghetto. And so you're marrying other Jews, you're eating with other Jews, you're preparing food for other Jews, you're having birthday parties with other Jews. Not such a big problem. But these last two are a huge problem. Rabbinic literature says you cannot have any interaction with a Gentile that would facilitate his idol worship. And you can't derive any benefit from idol worship. Now, why is that such a big deal? Because if you're a Jewish community living in, I don't know, Worms or Mainz or Frankfurt, wherever it is, the only way you can make money is by and large by buying and selling things with Christians in the big city or by lending money, which of course many Jews did. In other words, you need to have business transaction with Christians. But if Christians are considered idolaters, you're in big trouble because that's going to prevent you from doing any kind of business. So just, if you want to see a couple of examples of the kinds of laws that the Mishnah has regarding interaction financially with idolaters, it says in Mishnah Avodah Zarah, the very first Mishnah, 3 days before a festival, and again, I can't see this. I'm going to move all of your lovely faces to the other side. Oops, sorry. 3 days before a festival observed by idolaters, it is forbidden to conduct business with them, to lend or to borrow, whether things or money, to pay back or to receive payment. Why? Well, if Poseidon Day is tomorrow in the Mishnah, and you know the idolaters are going to be celebrating that, well, if you lend that Gentile money, they might say, "Oh yeah, I just got a big loan. Yay, I'm gonna pour out a libation to Poseidon." Well, you just facilitated idolatry. Or likewise, if you let them pay off the loan, They might say, yay, I just paid off my loan the day before the festival. I am now going to dedicate this to the god. So if you're involved in buying and selling, lending and collecting from idolaters around their festival, you are participating in idolatry. Likewise, a few Mishnayot later, it says, in no place may one sell to idolaters large animals, calves or foals, whether intact or maimed. Well, Rabbi Judah permits a maimed animal, and Ben Batera permits a horse. Well, why would the rabbis prevent you, if you live in an idolatrous city, from selling them, say, a cow? Well, because we assume there's a good chance they're going to use that cow in a temple to Mercury, and they're going to make a sacrifice, and you've participated in that idolatry. So that's why Rabbi Judah says, well, if it's a maimed animal, right, if it's a cow with 3 legs, well, even a pagan is not going to sacrifice a 3-legged cow to his god. And Ben Batera permits a horse, presumably because the value of a horse is not for sacrificial purposes. The value of a horse is for transportation. The concern here is obviously participating in idolatry. So you then have a problem if you take the perspective of, say, Maimonides. And he took this perspective in the Mishnah Torah, where he said, Christians are idolaters. And if they are idolaters, and they have a festival every Sunday, that means that 3 out of 7 days of the week, you can't have anything to do with them. He says the Canaanites are idol worshipers, and Sunday is their festival. Accordingly, in the land of Israel, it's forbidden to conduct transactions with them on Thursday and Friday each week, and needless to say, on Sunday itself. When transactions with them are forbidden anyway. I still can't see the words on the right side. But clearly what he's saying here, and some texts say Christians, some texts say Canaanites, there was censorship in the Middle Ages. He's clearly saying Christians are idolaters. It's that simple. So every law in the ancient Jewish corpus that has to do with idolaters applies to Christians. Now, for Maimonides, this was easy to say because Maimonides lived in Muslim Spain and Egypt, right? You could get along quite well avoiding Christians in those realms. But what if you lived in France or Germany or England or someplace where you were surrounded by Christians? What did you do? Well, there was a technique that was employed by these 12th, 13th, 14th century Ashkenazi scholars, which I would call an ad hoc approach, right? We had ad hominem, which means to the man. Ad hoc or ad hoc means to the situation. So what these Ashkenazi scholars did is they said, when it comes to this particular law, you take it one law at a time, when it comes to this particular law, we don't consider Christians to be idolaters. So we can buy and sell from them. Or, oh, so we can take their oath in a court of law. But what the Ashkenazi scholars always did was take it on an ad hoc, one by one, law by law manner. Never conceding that by definition Christians are not idolaters. We can just say that in one particular law, we don't consider them idolaters. But a major innovation occurred around the year 1300, when, again, another scholar from the Provence, whose name was Menachem Meiri, he wrote in his Beit HaBechira for the first time an argument that said Christianity is not in this law, and this law, and this law, each individual time, to be relieved from the category of idolatry. But he said that in an overall sense, Christianity should no longer be considered idolatry. And this was a profound moment in Jewish legal history that would have ramifications until the present day. Because what he argued was that Christianity is idolatry, but it's a different kind of idolatry than ancient idolatry. And the laws of idolatry have to do with ancient idolatry, not Christian idolatry. And he makes a very interesting point that I'll talk to you about to get that across. He says, these laws about interacting with idolaters, they were said concerning periods when there existed nations of idolaters and they were contaminated in their deeds, tainted in their dispositions. In other words, what he's saying is, ancient idolatry was not only worshiping a thing rather than God. That's bad enough. But ancient idolaters were also obsessed with sex and drugs and rock and roll. They were all terrible moral people, as well as being idolaters. He says Christians are different. Other nations which are restricted by the ways of religion, gedurot b'darchei hadatot, and which are free from such blemishes of character. On the contrary, they even punish some such deeds. Well, they are exempt from this prohibition. In other words, even though Christianity is idolatrous, Christians are good people. They reject sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Heck, they're puritanical. They're more fervent than Jews are in oppressing people who commit idolatry or people who do untoward things. I often make a joke here where I say, if you want to see an example of this, go on a Christian youth group trip to Israel and go on a Jewish youth group trip to Israel and tell me, which community is more contained by the moral expectations of religion. Anybody who's been on a Jewish youth group trip to Israel knows exactly what I'm talking about. The point I'm trying to make here is that what the Meiri said is that when idolatry is not connected to immorality, it's still idolatry, but the laws of the Torah and the Mishnah and the Talmud no longer apply. Tout court, right? That's French for on the whole, in general. Christians do not fall into the category of idolatry. Stop talking about it. Now, the Meiri was not widely accepted. Most scholars said, no, you're nuts. That's not true. We can continue to get out of it by going each law individually and every time saying, here we make an exception, here we make an exception. But they rejected, by and large, Meiri's claim that on the whole, Christianity is not idolatrous. Nonetheless, that was an important development in the medieval period, along with other important developments, which are the beginning of a systematic approach to Christianity and the further heightening of ad hominem attacks on Jesus, like we saw in the Toldot Yeshu. Now, this last passage, which has a generous understanding of Christianity, would come to inform modern views of Judaism that wished to overcome centuries-long animosity towards Christianity. And so just take a step back. What happens in the modern period with Jews is, that at the beginning of the 19th century, ghettos open up, European countries and America start offering citizenship and enfranchisement to Jews. And many Jews, especially those who were further east from the enlightened countries of France and Germany, these are very scary quotes, the Enlightenment countries of France and Germany, many Jews just sort of lived unaware of modernity, really until the 20th century. But for those Jews in Central and Western Europe who accepted citizenship and the vote and wanted to become brethren with their French Christian, English Christian, German Christian brethren, they wanted to see Christianity in a totally different way than it had been seen in the medieval period. They wanted to overlook all of the potential theological problems with Christianity. And so they said, we are no longer seeing Christianity as something that is idolatrous and terrible and that we should avoid, but rather we're going to the complete other end of the spectrum. We are going to argue that Christians are really our brethren, that we are all part of the same monotheistic movement towards a better world. And this became expressed most clearly in a very famous American document called the Pittsburgh Platform, which was the first great expression of American ideas in Reform Judaism, created again in Pittsburgh in the year 1885. And it was a series of 8 planks, 8 claims about what Reform Judaism is. And the 6th, I believe, claim was about the relationship of Judaism to other religions of the world. And they said, we recognize in Judaism a progressive religion, ever striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason. We are convinced of the utmost necessity of preserving the historical identity with our great past. And here's where they get into it. Christianity and Islam, being daughter religions of Judaism, we appreciate their providential mission to aid in the spreading of monotheistic and moral truth. We acknowledge that the spirit of broad humanity of our age is our ally in the fulfillment of our mission, and therefore we extend the hand of fellowship to all who cooperate with us in the establishment of the reign of truth and righteousness among men. Now, can you imagine any Jew writing this 100 years earlier, or 200 years earlier, or 400 years earlier? That would be unimaginable. And frankly, it was unimaginable to many Jews still in 1885. All those Jews on the Anatevka, they're not writing this. And Orthodox Jews to this day would probably not sign off on something like this, although as I'm going to suggest in closing in a few minutes, that there might be a few who do. But what you see here is a complete undoing of the medieval tradition, saying we no longer see Christianity as a negative force in the world. This doesn't say anything about whether it's idolatry. Maybe it is somewhat idolatrous, but the positive potential of Christianity and Islam working together with Jews in a providential mission that far outstrips any concern that we might have about their theological predilections. So that's one major change that has happened in the modern period. Another major change that's happened in the modern period is, of course, the state of Israel. And I didn't bring you the responsum because it's too long and it's in Hebrew, but there was a very important responsum that was written by Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Tel Aviv in the latter part of the 20th century, really a great scholar. And he tried to answer the question, well, if Israel is going to be informed by Jewish law, and we have Christians living in Israel, how can a Jewish state afford equal rights in every respect for Christians if they are idolaters? And he wrote a beautiful responsum. And guess what the main medieval source he draws on in that responsum is? It is the Meiri. He says, look, the Meiri told us 700 years ago that we can exempt Christians from all the laws of idolatry. Therefore, the state of Israel can feel comfortable in treating Christians as if they were non-idolatrous people. Obviously, Muslims can be treated as non-idolatrous people, no problem. What was interesting about that responsum is that elicited a lot of complaints because a number of Orthodox rabbis said, look, we agree with your conclusion. We're going to treat Christians like everybody else in the state of Israel. But you can't say they're not idolatrous. They're idolatrous. We just find exemptions for every rule. And so even today, or 20 years ago, 700 years later after the Meiri, there is still argument in the Orthodox community. Are Christians by definition not idolaters, or can Christians only be exempted from particular laws on a case-by-case basis? That is still a lively debate in Orthodox communities, if in conservative and Reform communities, by and large, that is overlooked in favor of the hope that joining hand in hand with Christians will have a positive impact on the world. I want to talk about one more change that's happened in modernity that actually affects me a great deal, and then close with a text in which I try to suggest that even though the modern Reform and conservative movements seem to have gone far away from the medieval animosity towards Christians, there's actually a text from the medieval period that I think suggests very much what the Reform and conservative movements are saying today. Before I get to that, I want to talk about one more development in the 20th century, which has been the rise of Jews and Jewish scholarship on Jesus and early Christianity. I am a product of that. A lot of people think it's, oh, so unique, a rabbi, a Jew who studies early Christianity and Jesus and Paul. It's actually quite normative nowadays. And I would suggest that many of the best scholars of Jesus and Paul living today are Jews. And I'm not including myself among them. Many of the scholars I admire are Jewish scholars of Jesus or Paul. Now, much of that is probably anticipated in developments in Jewish scholarship and again in liberal Jewish movements about 150 years ago, where Jews started to change the way they think about Jesus. By and large, when I come across Jews and they talk about Jesus, they don't tell me things that they might have read in Toldot Yeshu. Oh, his mom was raped by a Roman soldier, and he was a sorcerer and an idolater, and he was a terrible guy. I usually hear, oh, he was a prophet, he was a great teacher, he was a visionary. And much of this comes from scholarship from Jews and also from Christians in the last 150 years that have argued that Jesus was, in fact, probably a Jew loyal to the law, who never intended to start a new religion, never intended to do anything that would radically transform Judaism in the way Christianity has. So oftentimes, you'll meet kids today. Jesus was a good Jewish teacher. The other side of that is that once Jesus is saved from being the bad guy, someone has to become the bad guy. And for the last 150 years, it's become my boy Paul who has become the bad Jew. You see it over and over again. I hear it in synagogues, I see it in scholarship. Jesus was the good, loyal Jew who was misunderstood. It was Paul who said, you can be a Jew without circumcision. You should get rid of the law. God rejected the Jewish people and turned to the Gentiles. Paul is the bad Jew. And this dichotomy between Jesus the good Jew and Paul the bad Jew shaped a lot of Jewish thinking in the 20th century. I can report that in the 21st century, there is a movement to try to see Paul as a good Jew as well. I'm skeptical of it, but it's a major conversation going on in scholarship today. Where that will go, I don't know. At the Orange County Scholars 40th anniversary party, I'm happy to give another lecture and we can talk about maybe what has happened with scholarship on Jesus and Paul in the last 20 years. But nonetheless, that's a major development. And if you think about it, going from Jesus boiling in hot excrement to the narratives of Toldot Yeshu, to the predominant position in scholarship among Jews today that Jesus was actually a pretty good, loyal Jew, is a major, major turnaround, as profound as moving from the animosity of polemical literature in the medieval times to what we saw in the Pittsburgh platform. But in closing, I want to bring us back to the Pittsburgh platform one more time and talk about one line in it and what I see as possibly a precedent in a medieval text that is generally hostile to Christianity, but I think has a lot of potential. And it's this line here which says that Christianity and Islam, being daughter religions of Judaism, we appreciate their providential mission for the spreading of monotheistic and moral truth. This is not a new idea in 1885. Indeed, I would suggest that this idea that Christians and Muslims are different from all other non-Jews and that they have a very special role in God's plan for history goes all the way back to Maimonides, who I assure you was no friend of Christianity. Some people think he was a friend of Islam, that he was even Muslim. I don't think that's true. But some people, he was clearly enamored with Islam to some extent, but he hated Christianity. And yet, even Maimonides says, yeah, Christianity has a very important purpose in the world, a good purpose in the world. So he writes, can there be a greater stumbling block than Christianity? All the prophets spoke of the Messiah as the Redeemer of Israel and their Savior who would gather their dispersed and strengthen their observance of the mitzvot. In contrast, Christianity caused the Jews to be slain by the sword, their remnants to be scattered and humbled, the Torah to be altered, and the majority of the world to err and serve a God other than the Lord. So it starts with the standard medieval animosity. Christianity is the opposite of Judaism and the worst thing that could have ever happened. Nevertheless, the intent of the creator of the world is not within the power of human minds to comprehend. For God's ways are not our ways, nor are God's thoughts our thoughts. Ultimately, all the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth and that Ishmaelite who arose after him will only serve to prepare the way for the Messiah's coming and the improvement of the entire world, motivating the nations to serve God together, as the prophet Zephaniah states. I will transform the peoples to a pure language, that they will all call upon the name of God and serve him with one purpose. And how will this come about? The entire world has already become filled with the mention of the Messiah and Torah and mitzvot. These matters have been spread to the furthermost islands, to many stubborn-hearted nations. They discuss these matters and the mitzvot of the Torah, saying, these mitzvot were true, but were already negated in the present age and are not applicable for all time. In other words, what Maimonides is saying here is that Christianity and Islam are designed by God to help prepare the world for the return of the Jewish Messiah. How so? Christians go out the world over and teach people about the Bible and the Messiah and the commandments. They get it wrong. That's what Maimonides is saying here. They get it wrong. But in the least, people in China and India and the New World, they know about God's Bible. So when Messiah comes, it's going to be so much easier for those people to understand what's going on. And he doesn't say it here, but when it comes to Islam, he says Islam is going the world over and introducing monotheism to the pagan nations. So when Messiah comes, everybody will already be ready for monotheism. So he's saying that Christianity and Islam are sort of way stations, halfway to Judaism, that are spreading throughout the world and preparing the world for the eventual triumph of the Messiah and Judaism. And I don't think that's all that dissimilar from what we pray for in the Aleinu every day, that one day every tongue will swear loyalty to God and every knee will bend, and so on and so forth. And if that really is our hope, then maybe we don't need to think only with modern Jewish writers when speaking about Christianity and Islam. Already someone like Maimonides is saying, agreed in a triumphalist kind of way, but is already saying that Christianity has this sort of purpose in God's plan for history, a purpose that is in line with what Jewish hopes and aspirations are. So with that, I will stop and take questions for as long as you would like to ask them.
Thank you, Rabbi Garroway. I'm going to stop your presentation if that's okay, so we can see you. Is that okay?
Oh, for sure. I didn't know you couldn't see me.
Okay. No, we can see you, but now I can see all the people here.
Oh, okay.
So that was wonderful. Thank you so much. So if anyone would like to ask questions, feel free to write them in the chat. Someone had asked, there was a couple questions about some terms. Someone had asked in the chat earlier if minim was a term that was used for the followers of Jesus in the Talmud. Are you familiar with that?
Of course.
Yeah.
So, by the way, in that polemical treatise I showed you from Joseph Kimchi, the conversation between the Christian and the Jew is a conversation between a min and a ma'amin, a heretic and a believer, Christian and Jew. So certainly by medieval times, minim was understood to be Christians. There is a tremendous amount of debate about what minim means when it appears in rabbinic literature in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, because there were many different kinds of groups that it appears Jews referred to as minim. It could be Jews who were lapsing into something that we would today call Gnosticism, some kind of Platonic philosophical form of Judaism. I imagine sometimes they were lapsing into Christianity, or lapsing into one of the many other religious communities, mystery rites or pagan rites that were in antiquity. So minim is kind of a catch-all word for Jews who are not behaving the way the rabbis think they ought to behave. Sometimes it does refer to Christians, other times it does not. And in most cases, it's hard to figure out exactly who it's talking about at all.
Wonderful. I see that question that we just asked about meaning was from Ken Levin. So thank you, Ken, for that. And I see a question from Rochelle Ambersound. This is a great feminist question. She said, how would the conversation be different if Christianity and Islam were the sons rather than the daughters of Judaism?
I really don't know.
I think maybe it's a rhetorical question, but I like the thought there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know what I can't answer that except to tell you that in recent times the trend has been not to speak about. I'm not going to speak about Islam now, but the trend has been to speak about Judaism and Christianity, not in a parent-child relationship, whether father-son, mother-daughter, but to speak of Judaism and Christianity as a sibling relationship. And the reason for that is the idea that both rabbinic Judaism and Christianity are significant deviations, in historical terms, significant deviations from the Second Temple Judaism and the biblical religion that preceded them. So that doesn't make sense from a Christian confessional perspective, right? From a Christian confessional perspective, you had biblical religion, and its natural extension was Jesus and the New Testament. And Jews missed the boat. They sailed off that way, and they shouldn't have. Whereas from a confessional Jewish perspective, there's biblical religion, and its natural extension is rabbinic Judaism. And Christians veered off the path. But from a non-confessional perspective, from a historical perspective, it looks more like there was a Second Temple religion, which fell apart because the temple was destroyed. And some Jews tried to make sense of that with rabbinic Judaism. Others tried to make sense of it through Christianity. And those were the two expressions of ancient Judaism that continued to emerge. So in that sense, you often hear brother, 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 sister, some kind of sibling relationship. Yeah.
Thank you. Ahuvaho asks this question: have you studied the attitude of Abravanel, I think that's Abravanel, on Christianity? He focused on the founding of Christianity by the evil Edomites who moved to Rome.
Right. So I don't know Abravanel. You mean Abravanel or Abarbanel from like 16th century, late 15th century Spain? I don't know his writings, by heart. But it was actually quite common already in rabbinic times to equate Rome with Esau and Edom. That was standard. And this actually became an important debating point that Christians took advantage of, because sometimes you got to hand it to Christians. They have a really good argument in antiquity. So you know that one of the things the Torah argues is that younger sons are better than older sons. Now, if you have my wife to speak, she'll explain to you that the reason for that is no doubt because when Israel was emerging as a major player in the area, it was emerging against ancient Egypt and the Assyrian Empire, and the Israelites were trying to say, hey, we're the new kids on the block, but we're actually the best. And so you get the narratives of Jacob supplanting Esau and so on and so forth. And the problem is that once someone comes along to replace Jews, all of a sudden they can use their own narrative against you. And so what Christians began to say in the early centuries was, no. We're not Esau and you're not Jacob, which is your claim. In fact, we're Jacob and you're Esau because we are the ones that are the newcomers that are supplanting you. So the age-old biblical rhetoric of the newer is better than the older would actually come to stab Jews in the back when Christians came along.
I see a question from Lori Perlman asking, is there any question in Judaism during any period as to whether a man named Jesus actually existed or was a later fictional construct?
Is there any evidence? Well, it depends on what you consider to be evidence. In my opinion, the evidence for the existence of Jesus is so overwhelming that to deny the existence of Jesus as a historical character is not a legitimate scholarly position. The idea being that so many people are writing about Jesus of Nazareth within 20 years of the time that he would have lived. I mean, I study Paul. Paul wrote 7 authentic letters within 20 years of Jesus's lifetime, claiming to have interacted with the people who knew Jesus and so on and so forth. If Jesus was just a figment of someone's imagination, the level of conspiracy that would be required to pass off what would become Paul's letters and the Gospels and so on and so forth is just too vast for me to imagine. Now, please keep in mind, I'm a very committed Jew and rabbi. One of the things I often have to say when I speak is I am not a Christian. I don't think Jesus died and rose from the dead. I think Jesus died and stayed dead. But I don't feel the need. I shouldn't say I don't feel the need. That's not fair to what other people are saying. I don't think there is any compelling evidence that Jesus didn't exist, or even that Jesus didn't do many of the things that the Gospels say that Jesus did. I'm actually more of a maximalist than many of my Christian brethren in reading the Gospels. But the key is, I don't think Jesus rose from the dead. And if that's the case, he's a historical figure, a lot of fun to study, but he's not going to be at the center of my religion.
There's a question from Dale Schatz, who is a prayer leader and musician in our community. And he says, "It is my inclination to feel that the only oneness is the source, who is God. I'm uncomfortable with the last paragraph of Aleinu and the assertion that we aspire to oneness as people. Rather, I'd like to think we aspire to perfect pluralism. Was Christianity a response against the oneness of Jewish people and practice toward a more broadly pluralistic peoplehood?"
I mean, that's a really tricky question. And of course, by the way, Aleinu, you know, is a very controversial prayer today. All of it, not just the second paragraph, but also the first paragraph. In some respects, Christianity is a universalization of Judaism, to the extent that Christianity argues that religion and ethnicity, or religion and nationality, are distinct. Judaism has never accepted that. It's one of the reasons why Christians have such a hard time understanding Jews, because Christians think of Judaism as a religion and don't understand that it's also an ethnicity and a nationality, all three combined into one. And what Christianity does is make the religious component more universal in a way that we Jews simply can't do. And by the way, this is rearing its ugly head nowadays with the whole debate over Jews of color, because there is still an entrenched idea in Jewish communities that we are ethnic and national, and that ethnicity and nationality is often European. Christians have less trouble with that. If African bishop, South American bishop, Alaskan bishop, it doesn't matter, right? Because it's a religion, it's a set of ideas. So in that way, it is more universalized. However, Christianity has the same oneness and triumphalism in it as Jews express in the Aleinu, right? The idea is, of course, that this religious idea will eventually overtake the entire world and produce a world of only Christians. In that respect, I think Judaism actually has a more pluralistic kind of approach, in that it very rarely has the belief that all people will be the same. Even that all people will be Jewish, so that even in eschatological, or I don't know if people know that word, even in a futuristic thinking that suggests that one day all people will swear loyalty and bow on their knees to God, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to become Jews. It just means they're going to become whatever they are, but get rid of idolatry and polytheism.
Well, with that, I think we'll wrap it up. It's 1:40, and this has been an amazing presentation. Thank you so much, Rabbi Garroway.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
It's so nice to learn.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for being here. And tune in tomorrow with Danny Matt at, actually, that's tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. So we'll see you then, and have a great day. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye, Rabbi Einstein. Sorry.